For this module, I want to get started by creating a project right away. So let's do File, New Project. I want a new web application. I want to call it Patient Data for reasons that will become obvious in just a bit. And I want this to be a Web API application. Notice when I select the Web API template, I still have MVC selected. That's because even a pure Web API project is going to have a little bit of user interface that we'll see in just a bit. I am going to change the authentication mechanism. By default, when you select the Web API template, you have no authentication. Anonymous users are allowed in. I'll keep it that way for a bit, but eventually I want to use individual user accounts and show you how to register and log in just using JavaScript. So with that authentication in place, let me allow Visual Studio to create this project. And now that everything is ready, let's run the application and see what we have. And what we have looks just like a home page of other MVC applications that we've created, except there are some differences. Even though I ask for authenticated users, notice there is no register or login link up here in the navigation bar. That's because there is no account controller. At least there's no ASP.NET MVC account controller that renders views in a user interface. There is, however, a Web API account controller. The way you register and log in is by sending HTTP requests to the Web API. We'll be taking a look at that. Another difference in the navigation bar is the presence of this API link. And if I click on that, I'll see a page that is looking at all of the Web API controllers that are in this project and trying to provide a brief description about those controllers. So there is an account controller. It's a Web API controller. We'll be looking at that later. It exposes endpoints like account user info. If I do a GET to that endpoint, I should be able to get back some information. There's also down here a values controller. And what this help page is doing is inspecting your API controllers and trying to provide some basic documentation about how to reach those controllers, what endpoints they have, what data they accept. And so, for example, if I click on this API values, it will tell me that what it's going to send back is essentially an array of strings. And now if I go back and go up to, let's say, the account register, this one is telling me I have to do an HTTP post and I have to send along some information that includes the usernames, the user's password, something that will confirm their password. And you might have two questions at this point. First of all, where does this information come from and how do I get it to work with my controllers? And the second question might be, why is there always no documentation available? So let me answer the first question first. You can have this work with any of your API controllers. Essentially, there is a package installed. This package is the Microsoft.ASP.NET.WebAPI.Help page package. What it will do is look through the project and look for API controllers, try to find documentation about those controllers or use reflection, and it will basically dump out on those help pages all the controllers that you have available. Unlike many NuGet packages, this help page package does not install an assembly reference, so you won't find an assembly that does this, but you will, in the areas, find a help page area. And inside of help page, there's controllers, there's models, there's views that all work together to provide this help page. So that's the answer to the first question. And as we add more controllers will appear here on the help page. How do I get some documentation available? Documentation is very simple. You can add documentation by adding XML comments to your controllers. So for example, let me come into the values controller. And one thing I want to do is take off this authorize attribute for right now. But I'll add an XML comment right here. This is sample documentation. In order to get this to appear in the help page, there's just two things I need to do. First of all, I need to come into the build for this project. And I need to tell it to build an XML documentation file. And I actually want that XML documentation file to live in the app data folder. That will be a better place for it than the bin folder in this case. So that's one thing I need to do. And the second thing I need to do is come into the help page features. There is a help page config file with some configuration information. And I need to uncomment the first line here, which is set documentation provider. This is basically saying you're going to use an XML file. That XML file will be in the app data folder and it's going to be called patientdata.xml. Now when I do a build, I'll get a lot of warnings about not having some XML comments for all of my publicly visible methods. But I should also have, when I refresh this, at least for the values controller, a little bit more documentation than I had before. So there's the sample documentation that I entered just in the C# code inside of a comment. Visual Studio will build that into the XML file automatically. That feature's been in Visual Studio for many years now, since the beginning. And this Web API help page can make use of that XML file that Visual Studio builds for me. So all of my controllers can show up here. All of them can show up with some documentation. And this is very helpful for developers that need to figure out how to use an API that's been written. And the last thing I want to do before we leave, let's just make sure that the values controller is working. If I go to /API/values, then I get back value 1 and value 2. So the values controller does look like it is working. And if you haven't worked with the Web API before, if you go to my MVC4 Fundamentals course, I have a module that spends about an hour introducing the Web API, and then there's plenty of other courses on Pluralsight too. So let's start looking at some of the new things.